How do you preach so that people don't love the preacher? How do you witness so that people don't depend on you? How do you lead a Bible study so that you don't become the foundation of it, but the Bible and God become the foundation of it?
Are we pointing others to Christ or to ourselves? In this episode of Light and Truth, John Piper turns to 1 Corinthians 2, verses 1 to 5, to highlight Paul's resolve to preach Christ crucified and how the gospel's power shines when human pride steps aside. This sermon was originally delivered at Bethlehem Baptist Church on February 7, 1988.
In verses 1 to 5 of chapter 2, what Paul wants to do, I think, is illustrate from his own experience the present power of the cross and what effect it should have upon a believer. And I'd like to try to lay out the building blocks of this text for you to see one at a time and then look at a few of them together. What I see in this text are, first of all, two negative statements about how Paul did not come to Corinth. Secondly, I see two positive statements about how he did come to Corinth. Thirdly, I see him state the ground or the reason for why he came the way he did in verse 2, namely the cross. And I see in verse 5 the goal for why he came the way he came, namely so that faith wouldn't rest in him but in God's power. Let's take those one at a time. First of all, the two negative statements of how he did not come to Corinth. The first one is in verse 1. When I came to you, brethren, I did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God in lofty words of wisdom. So he says how he did not come, not proclaiming the testimony of God in lofty words or wisdom. Second, negative statement of how he did not come. Verse 4. My speech and my message were not in plausible or persuasive words of wisdom. And all of that is an echo of what we've seen already, isn't it? Back in chapter 1, verse 17, it says, God didn't send me to baptize, He sent me to preach, and not with eloquent words of wisdom, lest the cross be emptied. Now, when you stop and think about this, it sounds a little troubling, because when you read the letters of Paul, you open this book and read Romans, for example. This man was no dummy. He's one of the most profound thinkers that ever lived. The book of Romans has had a greater effect on the human race than any other writing. And when you read the way he uses language, he's no dummy. He can powerfully turn language for positive and negative effects. So what does this mean when he says, I didn't come to you in wisdom or in eloquence or speech of a certain kind? I think it means something like this. I never tried to flaunt my intellectual ability, nor did I engage in oratorical flourishes, because I didn't want to use anything that might win a following from people by appealing to what they are attracted by in their worldliness. I don't want a following like that, he says. I don't want people to follow me because I'm intelligent or because I'm eloquent. That's the point of saying I didn't come that way. I wasn't seeking that kind of following. I was striving not to give that impression, but to point everything to Christ and Him crucified. So that's the description of how he did not come. Now, how did he come? There are two statements regarding how he did come. Verse 3, I was with you in weakness and in much fear and trembling. And then the second statement that is positive and describes how he did come is at the end of verse 4. After he says he didn't come with plausible or persuasive words of wisdom, it says his speech and his message were in demonstration of the Spirit and power. So, you take those two together, and what you see is a man who, when he came to Corinth, was weak in his bearing, or demeanor. He was fearful. He was trembling. He was demonstrating the Spirit and power. Now, let's think about these. What is this weakness here? What does Paul mean that he came, and when he came, he was weak? Over in 2 Corinthians, there are several places where the Apostle Paul tells us what his opponents at Corinth were saying about him. And one of them is chapter 10, verse 10. And it goes like this. His letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech is of no account. It's despicable, literally. Now, there's the word weak. Evidently, when people looked at Paul, they were not impressed. He didn't cut a wake and cause people to kind of, whoa, this is somebody you better really stand up and listen to. They didn't. He came off as weak. And therefore his opponents used it against him. Now, what was it about Paul's appearance or demeanor, or was it more than that made him come off that way? I went over to Galatians chapter 4, verse 13, and found something very interesting, because when Paul describes to the churches in Galatia how they first received him, just like here he's describing how he first came to Corinth, there's a remarkable parallel. Let me read you this verse from Galatians 4:13 and 14. You know it was because of a bodily ailment. Now that word ailment is the same word as weakness right here in verse 3 of our text. Because of a bodily weakness that I preached the gospel to you at first. And though my condition was a trial to you, you did not scorn or despise me, but received me as an angel of God. Now, isn't that interesting? He says, when I came to the churches of Galatia, there was something wrong with me. An ailment, a weakness, so that you could have, had you not been kind, despised me. He looked very unappealing. Now, what is this? What is it about Paul that is marked as weak, almost despicable, and unattractive in his appearance? I really do believe it's connected with the thorn in the flesh. And the reason I do there are a couple reasons. The thorn in the flesh is described in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And in those verses, Paul says that he asked the Lord to take this thorn in the flesh away 3 times. And the Lord said no. And you know how the Lord responded. He said, no, because my power will be made perfect in your what? Weakness. And it's the same word that's used in Galatians 4 and in 1 Corinthians 2. And so I'm inclined to think that when Paul said, I'll all the more gladly boast then in my weaknesses, for when I am weak, then am I strong, or then does the power of Christ rest upon me, he was exulting in whatever it was that came across to these people as unimpressive. And here's the second reason I think there's a link up with the thorn in the flesh. Jesus says that the reason, or Paul giving the Lord's rationale for why he leaves the thorn in the flesh in Paul's body, is that you might not be, and I think a good translation would be something like overinflated, overly puffed up with your abilities as an apostle. Which ties exactly in with the use Paul made of his weakness in chapter 2. And the use he made of his thorn in chapter 12, namely exulting and boasting in it, that the power of Christ might rest upon him. So I think, I don't know, an eye disease, some people think, maybe it ran and was very unattractive. Maybe a back problem that he stooped or funny. maybe a lisp in his speech, since it's sometimes connected with his despicable speech. Here was a man who did not impress when he spoke, and he never hid it. He exulted in it, because it gave an occasion for all glory and power to go to Christ. The connection that he makes in our text with power is very, very significant. But we'll come back to that in a moment. Let's go to the term fear and trembling. What does fear and trembling mean? He came in weakness and in fear and trembling. Well, at least I would say it means this. He didn't come cocky. He didn't come with a swagger. He didn't come with ostentation or vanity or pomposity or with his nose in the air saying, you better listen to me because I am the great Apostle Paul. But on the contrary, his hands were sweaty in the palms and they shook. There was a butterfly in his stomach when he stood up to preach. And I think the reason was, as you look at the rest of the book, a profound sense of his own inadequacy, the profound sense of the eternality of the stakes here, and the real dangers at Corinth. I mean, when you read the book of Acts, chapter 18, verse 10, Christ had to come to him in a dream in the middle of the night and say, don't be afraid, Paul, keep on preaching and I'll take care of you. It was dangerous. Most of us have no idea what it means to be a Christian in a dangerous place. Believe me, it will make you experience fear and trembling. And somebody might say, well, wait a minute, I thought Christians were supposed to be fearless and confident people. Don't they have God on their side? And if He is for us, who can be against us? And as I thought about that, I read a great couple sentences from John Calvin on this text, who knew a lot about persecution and suffering and opposition. And what he says about Paul's suffering here and his fear, I think, is exactly right. And so I want to read it. Calvin says, the servants of the Lord are not so dull as not to see threatening dangers, nor so insensitive as not to be affected by them. No. In fact, they must be seriously apprehensive for two reasons. One, that humbled in their own eyes, they might learn to lean and rest completely on God alone. And that secondly, they might be trained in true self-denial. Paul, therefore, was not without a sense of anxiety, but he controlled it so that he nonetheless continued to be undaunted in the midst of crises. In other words, if you never tasted fear, if you never once tasted trembling, you would very likely begin to take for granted your own abilities and your own courage and your own heroic powers. Whereas once you taste the fear, then you fly to Christ, then you get sustenance to carry through, then you know who's helping you. That seems to be the dynamic that Paul experienced. That's what I experienced. That's what Calvin said is normal Christian living. And I think he's right. You will get into circumstances in your life in which there will be trembling, there will be fear, there will be sensed weakness. And then you cry to God, and God meets you in those moments of fear and sustains you as a trembling child through the doing of your duty. Now, what's all this got to do with the cross? He's trembling, he's fearful, he's weak, he's unimpressive, he avoids flourishes of oratory, he avoids intellectual ostentation. What's all that got to do with the cross? It's got everything to do with the cross, and verse 2 shows what it has to do. You see the little word that starts verse 2 there? The word for, or because, providing the ground or the reason why Paul came to Corinth the way he did. He says, it's because I decided to know nothing among you except Christ Jesus and Him crucified. The explanation, the bottom line explanation for why Paul was willing to come in weakness and why he denied himself the glory-getting powers of oratory and intellectual display is Christ crucified. I don't think that means that the only thing he spoke about during the 18 months he was in Corinth was the cross. We know that because when you read the rest of the book, you find him scolding the Corinthians for not understanding things which are more than the cross. Because they should have remembered the things that he said, which were more than the cross. Well, what does it mean then? That he decided not to know anything but the cross. I think it means something like this. If I know anything else or say anything else or do anything else, I want to know it and say it and do it in relationship to and conformity to Christ crucified. I want everything in my life to reflect Christ crucified. I want everything to be shaped by the cross. I want to make my tents in the shadow of the cross. I want to preach my sermons in the shadow of the cross. I want to dispute with my opponents in the shadow of the cross. I want to eat and drink and sleep Christ crucified so that I can say, for me to live is Christ crucified. And the effect that had on him was to make him a humble and broken-hearted, loving servant of the people of God. So out of step with the glory-grubbing world that we live in that the only explanation for the Apostle Paul is the power of God. Now, I haven't said much about the word power in verse 4 and verse 5, so I want to wrap things up by tying in this word power to the weakness that Paul came in and try to define what this power is that he refers to here. You see at the end of verse 4, it says that he came and that his message was in the demonstration of the Spirit and power, that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power, there it is again, of God. Now, a lot of people take this to mean miracles. He did miracles in order to authenticate his speech as being authoritative and true. And I don't want to dispute for 1 minute that Paul did miracles. You can see it in the book of Acts. You can see it in his own testimony in his writings. I don't think that's what this word power means here, however. And I'll try to show you why. The closest analogy or parallel to what we're reading here is what comes before in chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. It's a remarkable parallel, in fact, and leaves the word power ringing in our ears in a very different way than miracles. Christ did not send me to baptize, this is 1:17, Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with eloquent wisdom, there's the connection with our text, lest the cross of Christ should be emptied, nullified, made vain or void. And I think it's right to say powerless, that is emptied of power, because you read on and it says, for the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is power. The power of God. So, just from that text alone, with all of its connections with our text today, I would say the first assumption anybody should make in verse 4 and 5 of chapter 2 is that the power of God referred to is none other than the word of the cross. The power of the word of the cross. Now here's a second reason that I think this. Look at verses 23 and 24 and 25 of chapter 1. What you see there, remarkably, is two kinds of people. One kind wants a display of intellectual power, right? The Greeks seek wisdom. Come on, show us if you're worth listening to, your mental apparatus. And there's another group of people who want what? They want signs. What are signs? They're miracles. Come down from the cross if you're the Son of God. Come on, give us a reason to believe that you're the Messiah. Physician, heal yourself. They're saying the same things in Corinth that they were saying outside Jerusalem. Come on, if you're an authoritative spokesman of the Messiah, give us some power. Give us some miracles. And Paul, over against the demand for miracles, puts what? The word of the cross, and he calls it the power of God. So that all the more so am I not inclined to interpret this word power in verse 4 as miracles. In fact, I see it as a critique of an overemphasis on miracles. The keynote of power in the apostolic preaching is the word of the cross, and a crucified preacher is the power of God, not the sign worker and not the man who speaks with wisdom. For Paul, the cross preached by a crucified preacher was the power of God. Verse 18 of chapter 1 and verse 23 to 25 of chapter 1 and verse 4 and 5 of chapter 2. Paul, I believe, wanted more than anything else to get out of the way of the power of God. Just get out of the way. And he struggled, and I struggle, and you struggle with how do you get out of the way? How do you preach so that people don't love the preacher? How do you witness so that people don't depend on you? How do you lead a Bible study so that you don't become the foundation of it, but the Bible and God become the foundation of it? He wanted to get out of the way. He dreaded, wouldn't you agree from verse 5 that he dreaded anyone pinning their hope and faith on him as a preacher with his wisdom or his eloquence. And so what did he do? Dreading this and longing to get out of the way so that the power of God could come through and be the foundation of their faith. He died, he says, every day. I think that's what verse 2 means. I decided not to know anything in my life but a crucified life. I decided not to do anything but a crucified way. I decided not to speak any word but a crucified word. For me to live is Christ and Christ crucified. That's the only way I know how to get out of the way. And so he died to intellectual show. He died to impressive eloquence. He died to the secular demands for a suave, self-assured, powerful, attractive media performance. He died to that. I came to you in weakness and in fear and trembling in order that your faith and my faith might not be in the wisdom of a man, but in the power of God. And so my closing plea is to beg you not to leave the cross back there in the dim and dusty past where it's just a relic, even if it's a relic of the substitutionary atonement, so that you can now bask in all the benefits of the King. Don't do that. This text says, bring the cross out of the past as an executionary instrument into the present and die on it. And Jesus says, every day. Every day. And don't reach out to the future, to the streets of gold and the kingly dignity of the glorified saints and try to drag them inappropriately into the present where they become so contaminated and so misused in our power grubbing. Leave them there and walk the Calvary road, which ends there, not the streets of gold. Leave them for the age to come.
This is Light and Truth, God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. Thank you for listening. On our next episode, John Piper continues our 9-part series, Living in the Light of the Cross, with a sermon titled, God's Wisdom in the Cross. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.